but I'm not sure that MacG has ever said something as upsetting to the South African population as he said last week. When talking about Minnie Dlamini's breakup, he described her private parts in an extremely derogatory and offensive way, and in doing so humiliated a powerful black woman by speaking of her body and speaking of her sexuality. And that caused some people, including a member of parliament, to want to take him to parliament. It's caused a discussion about whether or not South Africa should have laws like the BCCSA affecting podcasters or not. And it's caused a massive, often gendered cultural divide and argument about whether or not this was completely unacceptable or whether or not MacG is unfairly being cut down and people are trying to cancel him. And so I thought I would pull back and get on the show our absolute, genuinely favorite guest, the person who's been on this show more than anybody else besides me and Mashed Up Potatoes. She is a phenomenal researcher, academic, and cultural commentator. Please give a warm welcome to Fezokuhle Mthonti. She's back.
Oh my gosh.
How much did you pay them? Wow, that
right?
was nice.
Thanks, guys.
Fezi is here. We've known each other since we were degenerates at the university currently known as Rhodes. But I love to talk to you whenever there are these cultural explosions. We've had you on when the Americans were coming for Tyler, amongst other things. But tell me, as I now introed this MacG situation, what are your top-of-the-line impressions about the incident, what he said, and the subsequent kind of discourse explosion?
Sure. I think, firstly, incredibly shocking, as you have already given us some sense into. But I think we need to think about the broader context and think about what kind of languaging around women is permissible in kind of platforms like this, right? So I think often the conversation about MacG is it's not that deep. We're just chilling where that chillers and we're just having a good time. It's just jokes. In fact, this morning I watched one of MacG's old rants on television, on YouTube, thinking about the fact that, you know, he shoots from the hip. He is telling the truth.
Telling it like it is.
Telling it like it is. It's important to note that it is his truth, not the truth. And what that particular truth is ordered by a very particular patriarchal and misogynistic world order.
Okay.
That it assumes that women's bodies are there for a continuous loop of reification. And we've spoken about this before, about how women who are particularly available in the public eye get less grace. Right? Because we project our fantasies and our desires and our insecurities on these women. And so often they get the worst of the logic of patriarchal order. They get the worst of the blame, the worst of the shaming. And so when we hear MacG talk about this woman's private parts or her genitals and suggest that there might be an area of disgust and the idea that in fact she can't necessarily keep a man and her not being proximate to a man is something that makes her less than, that makes her less desirable, and therefore there needs to be ideas around shame. We know that that is inherently problematic. But more than that, there's also a general conversation about how misogyny treats women's bodies as a site of disgust, as a site of constant control and a site of constant disciplining, right? And so if you understand Minnie Dlamini as a person who's become transgressive to that patriarchal order by just living her life, her easy breezy life. If you just critique that idea and assume that then she's a transgressive person because she is not going through the patriarchal orders, then what we see is a constant belittlement of women. And this is not just about Minnie Dlamini. This is about the kinds of things that we then hear generally about people in this world, about women in these worlds. And we understand that because it's projected through her primarily.
And it's not one of those, oh, apparently I heard, or this is just a thing, take it or leave it, because it does the damage instantly. It's not treated as, oh, Mac thinks this, or maybe he heard this, or this is just a rumor. It's treated as, MacG said this. But there's millions of subscribers, there's enormous influence over many people, and that's why it became such an uproar that Sunday Times made him the Mampara of the week, which weirdly in South Africa is a big thing. If you're Mampara, never quite understood how that happened, that Mampara of the week matters, but it's cool, it's their thing. And then let's talk a little bit about the response, because Mac's sidekick, Sol Penduka, basically spent a lot of time on the dark place formerly known as Twitter this week, saying like it's not that deep and laughing it off and like talking about how people can't get cancelled and talking about other stuff. And it's and let's be honest, MacG is far too big to be cancelled. I mean, but the irony is his traditional radio and TV career initially failed because he would do stuff like this. And it's only in the freedom of the internet. And the irony of his new MultiChoice deal is that MultiChoice then had to come out and say, this is not what we would allow in our programming. So it's a tricky new situation for him. But let's talk about the response discourse, because a lot of very, very upset people, many of them black women, posited essentially what you just argued, and then a lot of very, very defensive, broadly younger men who are fans of MacG said, you're just trying to cancel him, it's unfair, you're cutting down one of the few people who is able to make it off of the sweat and toil of his own back and his own talent. And I have to acknowledge, not anyone can be a shock jock. It's not the easy way to do things. You know a million crass and ugly-mouthed people in the world, but it requires a particular kind of talent to pull off the shock jock thing. And he is, for better or worse, extremely talented at what he does. That's how he's got where he's got and how he can manage to pull massive celebrities onto his show to talk and often embarrass themselves through what they say. So tell me about what you've seen about the kind of cultural discourse battle that's happened in the last week over this moment and the response to it.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard Minister Leteke actually say that this is a kind of online gender-based violence kind of assaults that has happened on Minnie Dlamini. And in fact, that's part of our own laws and our own kind of white papers around gender-based violence and femicide, and thinking through the ways in which once we put things on social media is no longer this like pariah little thing that we do in the background anymore. MacG has a platform that is, I think, rivaling our biggest broadcasters. For example, like Ukhozi FM doesn't necessarily have the same kind of listenership that MacG might be able to fill in over a couple of minutes. And so it's really important to think about what platforming these kinds of ideas does. And it is important for us to think about regulatory practices and thinking about what these platforms mean in relation to the kind of messaging that they make possible. And we know that if a woman's dignity is infringed in this way, we need to be in a bit of an uproar in this country, because it means other women, other more normal women who are not necessarily in the spotlight, are going to have their dignity questioned in this way. But it is interesting for me that Moja Love, because Moja Love is a really interesting example. There are some weird programming decisions.
Pause. Do y'all know what Moja Love did? Okay, so Moja Love is a television channel. And they put out a press statement as though they were working, though they were Minnie Dlamini's PR, like condemning this. And then the next day they commented on some other news story, and then most people were like, there's a PR person trying to get a bag on contract at Moja Love. But Moja Love came out and said that they wouldn't stand for this, and we didn't really understand why they did that. But Moja Love's programming.
Exactly. We all know of this king, I say king derogatory, who is often there making some of the most abusive and shocking statements. And they suggest that this is a part of reality. This is really what is happening in the world. And so we never see kind of mediation happening within that context. We never see people trying to think through what is happening, if we can maybe resource some of the women that are implicated in the series. And so it seems disingenuous for Moja Love specifically, who contracted a shock jock, knowing full well that they wanted to contract a shock jock, to then take themselves away from this. And I think this is important, that we think about media shapes the kinds of stories that language our world and that make it possible for violence to happen. Because violence is not just something that happens in the ether over there. Violence is often premeditated. It is often socially given power. You understand the ways in which there's kind of social sanctions, and you then respond in particular ways. And when violence happens, it is the last rung. And what we are saying is that this discussion that Moja Love is having is a little bit disingenuous, but more than that, the kind of entrenched shock jock that we are seeing in the world does need to have a kind of a control mechanism, right? Because, like we say, there are like real, actual issues, constitutional issues that are kind of being not taken seriously in this moment.
Totally. It's actually really interesting because worldwide, the shock jock had gone out of fashion. And then podcasting on the internet brought it back.
Yeah.
Because there was all that freedom in it. But there was an era, you guys, I mean, maybe you remember if you were listening to radio in the 2000s, everyone was a shock jock.
Yeah.
And now nobody is.
Yeah.
It's been a complete thing. But Fezi, I want to finish by asking you, because something that you've explained really well before on this show is the impossible bind that the high-profile women victims of this kind of comment, this kind of explosion, this kind of controversy are in, because you could clap back, you could say, nah, it doesn't bother me, you could say nothing, but not any of those are ideal, and not any of those undoes what is done.
Yeah.
Or allows you to be the true victor in the situation. It's really hard for people like Minnie, people like Tyler, people like Bonang often. It's difficult.
It's incredibly difficult. I mean, I think we spoke about this with Mihlali.
Yes.
And so the idea is that once you are placed on this particular platform, people believe that you deserve every kind of criticism that you get there. But it is, in fact, what is happening is that projections of their own lives, of their own kind of desires are being placed onto you. What that then means is that you are susceptible to very kind of violent double standards, and whether you act in ways that are trying to advocate for yourself or trying to maybe clack back, as you say, you don't necessarily get a kind of grace. And there's a kind of misogyny that undergirds that. And we must remember that misogyny is the direct hatred of women. And we see that consistently play out on the bodies of women that are hyper visible.
For sure, for sure. Heavy topic, but she's the best, right? Fezokuhle Mthonti, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.